And we previewed optionals maybe 2 Fridays ago when we had our first lab or first assignment, a week-long assignment. And we said optionals is part of Swift, it's part of the Swift language. We said optionals represents two possibilities, right? So optionals is a type that represents two possibilities, right? Either we have a value or we do not have a value. Right? So we use an analogy of some sort of present or box or some package, whatever it is. Somebody left it to us. They said, hey, on the doorstep is this package. It's a box. There's something there for you. Great. We ran home. We're very eager to open our box, our package. We open it up. There's nothing there, right? So think of an optional like that package. You think there's something in there. Somebody told you there's something in there. You look and there's nothing in there. So an optional gives us this way of guarding ourselves against opening a box, expecting something there, and nothing is there. So that is an optional at a high level, right? So an optional, as we said again, our custom types or our Swift types we've seen before. So Swift types, data types, support optionals. Example, we have string. String written this way is not an optional, right? There's no question mark after the keyword string. It's a string, we use it as expected. For example, we could have var name is a string assigned to some name, Alex, right? I could print out my name in playgrounds. And all is fine. I get Alex in the console. There's no name mention of optional there. It's a string. No question mark. It's a string. It's a basic string. Now, if we were to declare some age as an integer with a question mark, right? And we were to go ahead and print out that age, we'll get a value nil, as we said before. So nil here represents there's nothing in that variable. Currently, that variable is nil, right? You could think about it as empty, but even empty itself is a value, right? But here, nil is absolutely nothing. Nothing exists. It's like before the galaxy got created, there was nothing. It's nil, right? So here, age is nil, right? So that is an optional. Question mark after the data type signifies it's an optional. You could option click on age here, and you get back, it's a variable, age, int question mark. That question mark there says it's optional, right? Let's see the next example. We have a number that we're trying to get back from some string. So here we have some string 5. And we're trying to initialize it or cast it to an integer using the integer initializing syntax. So here we have int followed by a parens, and you have a string in between the parentheses. So here we're trying to cast or trying to initialize some string to an integer. So our number, if we look what our number is, so if you option click on num, you also see int question mark. Does everybody see that? So here we have an optional int getting returned to us because there's no guarantee that this string is a valid integer. Everybody sees that? Because that string 5 could be anything. A string could be anything. Anything that is within those quotation marks. So here I could have, it's Monday. Is that a valid integer? No, it's not, right? Clearly we see it's a string, says it's Monday. There's no way we could convert this string to an integer. So again, the language protects us from that use case where we're saying, oh, we have this integer, let's go ahead and use it. So again, if you option click on num, it is an optional int. Any questions so far about the syntax of what an optional looks like? So again, either you have a value, as we said earlier, either you have a value or we do not have a value. In the case where we do not have a value, it's nil, right? If we do not have a value, we get back nil. So there's two options there with optionals. Either you have a value, go ahead and use it, or you don't have a value. In that case, it's nil. So here, let's create a header. This is the introduction of what optionals look like. And I'll just copy this here. Great. So here, introduction of optionals. We saw what the syntax looks like. So you have whatever type you have, followed by a question mark. That's an optional here. So here we have an optional int. Here we also have an optional int. Great. And we spoke about nil here, where age was nil. Doesn't have a value. And if you use type annotation in this way, you get nil by default, right? So optional int with default value of nil. Okay? And here we get a warning from the compiler. It says you're trying to print some optional. We'll see how to get rid of that warning later. But for now, let's keep that warning there. We do not click fix it for now, but let's see how we could get rid of that warning later. Okay, great. So let's go into the next topic. Let's talk about ways to unwrap optionals. We'll talk about forceunwrapping. As the first use case here. Okay. So we have our age variable. We all have access to our age variable. So if we go ahead and say print or create some result, or decade from now, and we say age plus 10, for example, and print go ahead and print decade from now. Right? If we go ahead, already we're getting a compiler warning says value of optional int, right? Let's pay attention to that warning. Value of optional int must be unwrapped in order to perform that operation, right? We can't add an optional value, age, we can't add that optional int to a regular int. the compiler still sees this as different types. Even if they're both ints, right? You have an int optional and you have a regular int. Does everybody see that? So here we cannot add optional int plus int, right? That's what the compiler is saying. You can't do those two. So how can we fix that? Well, if you start in Swift programming, the compiler gives you this warning. It also gives you fixes. It's like, hey, go ahead and use this forceunwrap here, right? So if we all go ahead and click the second option where it says forceunwrap with the bang or exclamation mark, right? Our error goes away. Does everybody see that? So it gives us two options. The first option we'll go over afterwards, nil coalescing. But the second option says go ahead and use forceunwrapping. Bang it, right? So here we have age exclamation mark. It says take the optional, unwrap it, make it a regular integer. Does everybody see that? So here, now the compiler is happy. It sees two ints. It's like, okay, you could go ahead and add them. Let's go ahead and run it. Our application crashed. Does anybody know why the application crashed? So as Yulia is saying, age itself is nil, right? So that's why it crashed. You're trying to access the value nil. You cannot access nil. It's going to crash your application, right? So here, forceunwrapping would definitely crash our application, right? Forceunwrapping is one way to quickly get to that value you want, but it's very, very dangerous, right? It's to be used very sparingly where you want your application to crash during development. As we get into later units, we'll see where the use cases are for that. But if you are not guaranteed to have some age, do not forceunwrap that value. Everybody with me? Okay, because we see what happens. You run your terminal application, your text adventure, it's awesome, you're about to run it, boom, crashes. What happened? I have a bang there somewhere. Okay, so that's forceunwrapping. Again, to be used sparingly. Only when you, the developer, is guaranteed a value at runtime, right? At runtime is while the application is running, right? Okay, so that does not compile. The only way this compiles, everybody typed out the comments already? I'm going to scroll up. We'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, we okay? So the only way to not crash right now is a couple ways. First of all, if we do have a valid age, that's a start. So let's go up to age, and let's say valid age is 21 here. So everybody go ahead on line 19, make sure you initialize it to 21. So far so good? Okay, so we'll go back down, run the application again, and now no crash, you do get 31, right? Assuming that the user did put in 21 or yourself did put in 21 as some default. Everybody with me? Okay. Now let's see the safe way to unwrap an optional. I'll go ahead and copy my, and here we'll do optional binding. Actually, let's do nil coalescing first. So nil coalescing. Okay. So again, ways to unwrap optionals. Let's list the names here, or the ways. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. First, we saw first unwrapping using an exclamation mark, right? And we're going to see, next we'll see nil coalescing. Using 2 question marks. Followed by a default value that we provide. So here, force unwrapping using an exclamation mark or some programmers. Okay, third, we will see optional binding using if let. Where a value is assigned, where a value is assigned where a value is assigned the existing value if one is available. And lastly, there is implicit optional, implicit unwrapping. Example, you could have a variable name, string. Option 4 we'll get into Unit 2. We'll talk more about Option 4 in Unit 2, where we implicitly bind in, or Xcode provides us with outlets to our objects using implicit unwrapping, so we'll have more context. It's one thing to show a topic, it's a different thing to actually know what it's used for, and to know what it's used for is better in actual demos. So we'll keep number 4 for Unit 2. But the first 3, we should know what they are, how to use them, when not to use them, especially number 1. Most likely you do not want to use number 1. Okay, so let's go down to nil coalescing. Everybody wrote the notes here? Okay, cool. So let's go down to nil coalescing here. Let's have a new variable instead of using age again. We'll have temperature, which is a double, not dispatch queue, we're not there yet. And we will default it to 75. Okay, so we have this variable temperature. It's a double, or let's just make it an int here. It's an integer, optional integer. It's defaulted to 75 degrees. Right now, we want to access temperature. We'll access temperature using nil coalescing and see what the syntax looks like. So here, I will say, I'll create a valid temperature, for example. I'll use temperature variable, so temperature here. So whatever variable you want to unwrap, in our case, we want to unwrap temperature. Everybody with me? I want to unwrap temperature, so I use temperature. Very similar to, the syntax here is almost similar to the ternary operator, right? But in that case, we have temperature here, followed by double question mark. So the double question mark here is the nil coalescing syntax. So valid temperature gets assigned some temperature. we guarantee to have some temperature here using nil coalescing. Either we have the valid temperature, in that case it's 75, or think of the nil coalescing syntax as an or an else, right? If you're valid, go ahead and give me your value. Else here, give me some default value. Everybody with me? So here in the else, or after the nil coalescing, we'll give it a value. For example, if we want it to be a nice 67, that's fine, that's good weather, right? So in that case, I'm able to use, let's go ahead and option click on our variables here. So first, my temperature. What's the type of my temperature? It's an optional integer, right? And if we option click on valid temperature, what type is it? It's a regular int, right? Optional is gone. We were able to unwrap it using nil coalescing here. Everybody sees that? Zara? Good? Okay. So here we were able to unwrap using nil coalescing, and 67 is the default value. So 67 is the default value. In the case, temperature is nil. Okay? Great. So now we could just go ahead and print temperature is valid temperature. Go ahead and run my playgrounds. And I'll get 75, right? Because there is a value. There is a value here. Temperature has 75. Does everybody see that? On line 52. Let's go ahead and experiment what happens. So if we remove 75 and make sure our code is as is currently on the screen, variable temperature, type annotation, optional integer. That's all we should have. And if we run our playgrounds again at line 56, we'll get 67. Does everybody see that? Okay? So that's nil coalescing there. It's very powerful, one line, if you have some default value, some value that should either that you as the person writing that application decides on that default value, or some value that's not a valid value, right? For example, age, if you say -1, you know, if you get back -1, something went wrong, okay? All right, cool, so let's go back to, actually, let's leave that here. I think that's good. Let's talk about optional binding. Any questions about nil coalescing before we move on? The syntax, you'll get used to it the minute you start writing it out. Yes, sir?
Why not send the default value of declaration?
In that case here,
Yeah.
it could be that you don't know the temperature yet. You could have a default value, that's fair. But for example, if you're getting some values from a database or whatever, you don't know what the value is, you can make it optional. If I do get a value, go ahead and use it. If not, I provide the default value. Does that answer your question? You can provide a value, yes.
Okay.
In that example here, I could just say int equal to 75. It's not an optional. But given an optional, how do I unwrap it? Bienvenido? Sorry, one.
Optional 75.
Can I make it optional 75? Like the case we had before?
And then you would still have to unwrap it later to add it to
Anytime you have an optional, you have to unwrap it to use it. Right? So if this is optional, in order for me to add it to some other integer, I have to unwrap that value. Because you can add different types together. An optional, regardless, even if it's an integer, it's different from a regular int. Yes? Does that help you?
Well, what if, so you, if there is an optional later, then in the previous example, you added it to something.
Is everybody okay down here? Can I scroll up? Okay, so let's go ahead. Line 41.
Yeah, so what if we're just trying to use an optional and then add
You want that example?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's stay on nil coalescing here and then make that new example. So let's see. We have, for example, let's have cloven maybe. So cloven, we have, it's a string, it's an option. Actually, you want an integer, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we want an integer here, that's fine. Let's put cohort is an int for now. Do you want the default value or?
Yeah, default value. 30.
In our case, we'll say 4, 5, or 6. So 4, 5, 6, which one? Okay, so 4, right? Cohort 4.0, whatever. So far, so good. Okay, so now we have an optional int. And you want to add it to something else?
Yeah, I want to add.
Okay, so for example, say next year, cohort next year cohort, right? So we want to add the current cohort plus 1, right? So next year, right? Right? In that case, the compiler, again, we can't add different data types together, right? So let's stay here together as a class. This is an int optional. Do we agree? This number 1 here is a regular integer. We can't add different types together. Here we have an optional. The only way to add it to an integer is to unwrap it, as the compiler is suggesting that we do, either through nil coalescing, right?
Right. So use that.
What do you want to use? Like fix it?
I don't use the nil coalescing.
Oh, on this one?
Yeah.
Okay, so here we could say nil coalescing, give it a default value, 5, right? Let's put some parens here to make this more readable and easier for the compiler to understand our intention. So here I have my cohort, which is optional. Yes?
Right.
I give it a default value of 5. So far, so good?
Right.
And whatever value gets evaluated from that expression gets added to number 1. You with me? So now let's go ahead and print out. So print, I have a statement here. Pursuit next cohort will be string interpolation next cohort year, right? Next year cohort. And here, to force our hand, let's just make this nil, right? Or you want to keep it at 4? We'll do both ways. So here, what's the expected result, everybody? 5, right? Does everybody see that? So let's go ahead and run it. So pursuit next cohort will be 5. Does everybody see that? Because we have a value of 4. When I open up my box, I open up my box here, right? I see my number 4.
Okay, so the default value of 5 is like, if it, for some reason it's empty, it wasn't declared or nothing, then just say it's 5.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Yes?
So if that's special rules, how will you assign this default value?
The default value is up to you. Here, 1, right? 1 picked 4. We could pick any number.
No,
Like, oh, that number 5 here? For our case, 5 makes sense because the next cohort after 4 is 5. You could choose 10, but we're not like, if you're making an app, right? You're making an app, a pursuit app. The default value should be, next year should be 7, right? Or the previous year is 5. Whatever that default value is there, it's up to you. You could pick any valid integer that makes sense to that application. In our case, if the user does not enter a number, we take 5 and we add 1 to it, and we say next year it's going to be 6.
Is there a possible situation that we cannot choose any default value and we should use different methods of that?
In that case, you could use optional binding, we'll see next. Or you could use a value like -1 here.
What is minus
-1
one?
is not a, well, in our case here, we have no cohort -1. Right? So if I get back -1, that means something went wrong. Everybody? Right? So if you have some age application writing, and you get back 1,000, for example, that's not a valid age. Does that make sense? I mean, we haven't figured aging yet, right? But 1,000 or -1, they were not valid choices. So if I get back -1 in my next cohort, I know this is invalid. It would, then you'd have to do an if statement, like if -1, then user added the wrong information. Let's just do it right now. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So instead of adding here, right, I could say if next cohort equal to -1, something went wrong. The only time I could come in that if statement, everybody, is if my value is nil. Do we agree? Do we agree? In the current state, the only way I get inside on line 63 is if this value cohort is nil. Like I told you to do some application, right? You guys are filling out the application for Pursuit, and you do not put in whatever, your age or whatever value we're trying to capture. Something went wrong. Go ahead and continue that application, or go back to the previous page. In our case, let's test it out. So if I do not put a value here, Julia, right? Okay, everything is good here, come in here. Okay, and in my else statement, so if this is equal to nil, actually I don't need a else, actually I could print. So in my else statement, have a print, you could type it out too for, because it's a good question to capture why the default is what it is. So here I could say else, everything went well, right? Everything went well. And if I get into here, I could print something went wrong. Right? With the application in that case. This is an application app we're writing. Right? So if we run that app now, what print statement happens? 63 of 65? 63, right? We agreed? Do we agree with Julia that is 63? Why is it 63, Cassandra? Cassandra says because the value is nil, the value of cohort. Do we agree, Ian? Of cohort is nil currently. We agree, right? David, do we agree? Okay, Brendan. So we agree that the cohort value is nil currently, yes? So if it's nil, right, I do my nil coalescing, cohort is nil, it goes to my default value, right? 2 question marks, else. If you have a value, great, use it, stop there. If you don't have a value, if you're nil, right, that's what the statement says. It's short, but a lot of things are happening. If cohort is nil, go ahead to my else statement. Go to my nil coalescing default value. It will be nil. It will be -1 here. So next cohort will be what? What will the value of next cohort be? -1, right? So if it's -1, I come to line 62. If next cohort equal to -1, is -1 equal to -1? Yes, so it comes into this print statement. Everybody agrees? Okay, let's run. So indeed, pursuit next cohort. Actually, what's happening here? Oh, sorry. I'm like, what's happening? So here we have something went wrong with the application. Everybody sees that. And if we see the next line, it does say cohort is -1, right? Which doesn't make sense in our use case, right? You're writing some application. There's no reason a cohort should be -1. Stop right there. Stop the user. Tell them go back, whatever. So here, that default value, Julia, it could be many things to your application based on what you're currently writing. If I'm writing, some weather app or whatever, maybe I want to do -1 because something went wrong. Maybe I do not want to do a default value of temperature. If I'm doing an import age kind of thing, like where you have to put your age in and you put in some bad value, I want you to add your age again because your age here is very important. So I put in -1 or put in some arbitrary value. You'll see also values like this, 999. If it's an age app you're writing, you might see 999 or 1,000, right? Who gets to that age? I mean, I don't know, but I don't even think I want to get to that age if it was possible. Everybody with me? So the default value, you choose it based on the use case of your application. Cool? If you're adding things together, a default value might be 0, right? If you're adding values together and some value, like grades, for example, you're taking grades in, and there's a bad grade or a grade that doesn't make sense, a good default might be 0. Don't add the thing. -1 is not going to be good in that case. Everybody with me? -1 wouldn't be ideal. 0 would be better. Great. So let's go next cohort. We'll go back to -1. Thank you, Juan, for that example here. Please bring more questions as we go through. Okay, so let's see. Why is forceunwrapping down here? Oh, because we're doing optional binding. Okay, so now we are doing optional binding. Our third demo example, optional binding. So we've seen nail coalescing and we've seen forceunwrapping. So far, so good. Implicit, as I said, we'll see later, because questions will be like, how do I use this? Where's the use case? What's the point of that? All those we'll answer as we get into app development or into object-oriented programming with structs and classes. So here, optional binding. Okay, great. So here we'll have some wage. So var wage is some integer defaulted to 40,000, for example. I'll show us again how to break up. It's the same thing, but if you want to represent 40,000 with a clearer picture as to somebody reading it, you use an underscore, right? So underscore, you could separate your integer values. Everybody with me? So here, this is 40,000. It's easier to read as opposed to this, right? So that's 40,000. Great. So here we'll be using optional binding. We'll be using if-let. You'll also see while-let. But here we'll demonstrate what if-let looks like. And let's create the next one, actually. So year, we'll say it's an int, and 2019. Actually, make it nil for now. So again, this is nil by default if it doesn't have a value. So nil by default if a value is not provided. Okay, great. So let's see what optional binding looks like. It starts off with if-let. So if-let some value. Here I'll say binded value for us to understand what's happening here. And the value we want to unwrap is after that equal sign. So it's to the right of the equal sign here, same as with the nil coalescing, right? So remember, left value is what you're getting assigned to. Right value is the operation. In that case, the operation is on wage. The operation on wage here says, hey, go ahead and look at this wage for me. The if-let says, look at wage. If wage has a valid value, a valid integer, assign it to binded value. Let's write as many notes as we can to capture that. So if-let, not tries, it actually unwraps. If-let unwraps the wage variable, right? Remember, optionals, either you have a value or you are nil, correct? We confirm that definition. So here, if-let unwraps the wage variable if it does have a value, right? Then that value gets assigned to the binded value variable. Right? Or constant, since it's a constant here. Okay, so if let unwraps, right? If let, our syntax here for optional binding. If let, right? Read it like this. If let wage exist, it does have a value. Go ahead and assign it to binded value. Let's read it again. If let wage has a value, assign it to binded value. You could put an extra note there if you want, right? So if let wage, right? Not if let binded value, don't read it that way, you'll get really lost really quickly. If let this wage, very similar to, let's just take a quick note here. Very similar to if 5 is less than 10, right? Right? So if 5 is less than 10, that's a condition, correct? It says if 5 is less than 10. Great. So that 5 less than 10 here is the wage. That's the condition. It says if true, if wage does have a value, go ahead and assign it to my binded value temporary variable. Assign it to that binded value. That's what the if let does. Right? So the only way I get into line 80 here, we only enter the if let block if wage is not nil. Does everybody see that? Does everybody see that? Jahid, can you explain to us what's happening? Line 79 to 82. I'll only enter it if what? So you're saying we'll only enter this if block if wage is nil. So, as we said here, so we only enter the if let block, the block here. We only enter that if let block if wage is not nil, right? In other words, yes, exactly. In other words, only if wage has a value. Right? Eric, can you explain to us what's happening in 79, 81, 83? What's happening here? Walk us through it. And then let's hear what's happening. That's fine. That's why we want to take a moment here so that we all could. Amini, explain to me 79 to 83. Very good. Did everybody get that? What Amini is saying? So stand up and say it again. Yes. Really project it to the interviewer for the job. The entire team wants to hear how you explain optional binding. Everybody with that? We haven't written an else yet, but Amini is saying basically we could have an else statement. If it doesn't have a value, we could have a print statement in that else block. But I want one other person to come up, or rather stay where they are, and explain to us what they're getting from this binded value optional unbinding there. Greg.
So if wage doesn't return nil, if it returns a valid integer, it will assign binded value that.
And now we have access to it in the if block, correct?
And it runs the if block if that returns a valid.
Okay, very good. So it's a learning process here. If we're still not comfortable with it, grab one of us, grab a fellow peer. Let's get on board. We have lab questions coming up to enhance our knowledge here. But again, it's harder to conceptualize because our wage doesn't have a more than sign, right? That's probably where we lost. There's no wage is more than or equal to anything. Everybody? It's just wage by itself. So it's harder to conceptualize here. But think about it like you have wage. I open up wage. Wage is a box. Everybody? It's a box. I open it up. If it has a value, I go ahead and use it in my if block, like with every other if condition. If it doesn't have a value, I can't enter my if block. Everybody agree? If it doesn't have a value, it's false. If it has a value, it's true. We could even write that too, right? So here, if wage has a value, the if-let is true, right? If wage is nil, the if-let is false. Okay? All right, cool. So here we have our binded value, it's wage. Now we could tell the user, if it's valid, print you entered wage, not wage, you entered binded value as your wage. Okay? So again, we're still within the if block. You could only use binded value here in the if block. Everybody with me? You could only use that variable name binded value inside the if block. You cannot use it outside. I can't use binded value here. My compiler does not see it. Right? I can't use it here. It's out of scope. Right? Use of unresolved identifier. You see that on a code challenge or anything, it doesn't compile. Okay? Binded value has only access within the if-let. Okay. So our wage is currently good. Everybody finished typing? Yes, sir.
That binded value, as you just said, is only
Available?
available to the tribe.
Yes.
So it's like only an optional that happens.
Well, if we declared a variable outside here, in that case, not binded value, we could use it inside of the if block. But here, the optionals, only to optionals, if-let only works on optionals, that binded value we use here, it's only available within. Exactly. Later we'll see guard. I'm not going to show guard right now, but later we'll see guard where if we guard some optional, we have access to it afterwards. Even if you say this is a var here, which is also valid, you could change it, but you still only have access within the if-let, or if var in that case. Okay? Cool. Yes, sir.
I had a question. I know that we use optional bindings to check if something's optional, but what if I just wrote if wage is not equal to nil?
That you could write that, but it's not Swifty, first of all. So I had it saying if I just write if, I'll come to that. So if wage, right, is not equal to nil, which you'll see in Objective-C, you'll see in other languages. Thank you for bringing that up. So this is valid, right? I'm guaranteed in here to not have wage. I mean to have wage. If I'm inside 81, I'm guaranteed it's not nil. Everybody sees that? I'm explicitly saying if wage is not equal to nil, come in here and do some action, right? But what is wage? Wage is still an optional. That's step one. It's still an optional. I still have to unwrap it. I had, right? And it's also not Swifty. It's not idiomatic Swift. You'll see that a lot, right? So this here, one wage, well, not one, not one, but one wage within the if is still optional, right? And two, not idiomatic Swift, or you'll see Swifty being used a lot, right? That means basically you're not using what the language is giving you, right? Instead of using what's in your toolbox or what should be in your toolbox, you're using legacy code. This is in Objective-C. Objective-C, you do not have optionals in Objective-C. So the only way you could check if something is nil by writing code like that, right? So in the early days of Swift, we would still write code like this a lot, until we got used to optionals. But beginning in Swift, first week in Swift, first 3 weeks in Swift, we should just be going into Swift full head on, right? Optionals is our friend, we use optionals. Everybody with me? So we do not submit code to people like this, right? Very, very good. Thank you, sir, for bringing that up. Cool. All right, great, 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 great. So did we print our thing yet? No. So go ahead and run your playground and let's see what happens here. So now we have, you entered 40,000 as your age. This is valid because wage, we assigned wage a value of 40,000. Everybody with me? Okay. So now let's go ahead and write an else and change what 40,000 is. So else print you did not enter a valid wage. And here we could actually just print out what wage is. I'll keep the print statement like that for now. Okay, now let's go back up to where we declared wage. Remove the 40,000, or just put comments here. So comment out the 40,000, go back and run the else, the entire playground again. And let's see what's our output. Our output says you did not enter a valid wage, nil, right? So wage here is nil. Did everybody get that? Right? As Amini was saying earlier, you could have an else on your iflet. In our case, we have an else. Else, if it's nil, go ahead and print out some statement or do some other action. If it's nil, go ahead and enter my else block. In that case, it's nil. Why is it nil? Because wage is nil. Does everybody see that? So if wage is nil in my optional binding, I have an else clause to capture that. Else false, else nil. Else condition is false, or wage is nil, right? Which it is. You did not enter a valid wage, right? So that's optional binding here. Any other questions? Oh, so who was asking? So that's Stephanie. So basically, it's an optional. Good question. Thank you for bringing it up. So this is an optional here, and the compiler is telling you, hey, this string produces a debug description for an optional value, right? So here it gives you a choice. You could add string describing by silencing it, Or you could give it a default using coalescing if you want, right? In our case, wage is what? What does it expect? It expects some integer. So here, actually, let's just silence the warning. That's easier. I'll come back to that later. So go ahead and click on the warning and say fix with using string describing. It's one thing to wrap our head with coalescing. It's the next thing to coalesce within an interpolation. So make sure you just go ahead and click use describing to silence the warning. Basically, what that does, it takes string, right, our string type, it wraps it in an initializer, and it gives us back the description of wage, whatever wage is in that case. So if you go ahead and run the playground again, instead of saying optional with a warning here, we'll get wages nil. So it silences the warning. Okay, Steph? But again, when you're more comfortable with nil coalescing, you could do it inline on the wage. Okay? All right, thank you. So let's do one other option here. If you think things was a little complicated, let's complicate it some more. All right, so let's go up top. So we have wage. Let's give wage a valid value. So comment out the 40,000. Make sure you have 40,000 commented out. I mean uncommented. And keep year nil. So currently year is nil. Everybody with me? Year is nil. Let's go ahead and add. You could add more optional binding onto your iflet. Okay? I could have more values that I unwrap here. I could say, hey, if wage has a value, go ahead and use it. I could also say, comma, some other variable name. What do we have? Year, right? Valid year, for example. Valid year equal to year. So you could link them together or chain them together. In that case, the two values need to have valid value. So wage needs to be valid, year needs to be valid, in order for the if-let to get executed. Yes, sir? Yes, it's like an and statement, as Jahidi said, right? True, etc. It's only true if everything is true. As Jahidi is saying here, it's only true if wage has a value and year has a value. We'll get more practice with that during lab today. But here you have two values. You use optional binding on those two values. I could have more than two values. I could have 5 values. Yes? In that case, no. You have to comma let in that syntax. That's the syntax for it. Yes, sir?
Can you use comma and others, like the regular statements
In the regular, if
It's like if you use a regular statement instead of using a double line,
the only time you could use if let, the comma you're talking about, like you have if, for example, one more. So you're saying if,
like a regular statement.
so if 5, right, for example, is less than 2, and like this, so that will not be valid, right? That's what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. So here, if you run it, actually I think it compiles. Let's see what the answer is. So this is 5 is less than 2, that's false. Let's see what we get there. In here, else. I love those derail. Okay, so out here. All right, so first evaluates to what? 5 is less than 2? Is that true or false? False. And the second one? Okay, let's see what's happening here. So already it tells us this never gets executed. First of all, I would never submit code like that, right? If you want to compound them together, I would just compound them together, because right now you're getting a warning here that will never get executed, right? Because right now the compiler is a bit confused as to what you're trying to do. But it's good that we see what you're talking about here, but I would just have an and if that's your explicit decision, or an or, based on what you want to do. Cool? So either I would have an and here, if you want to make sure both of them are true, right? Or I would have our regular OR statement. Cool? Warning goes away in that case. Cool? All right. So let's keep going. All right. So we have two values. We want to unwrap them. We chain them together here. We have binded value and we have valid year. Only if both are true or both have values will I come into my if let statement. Everybody's on board with that one? If any of them are nil, it goes to the else statement, right? Let's just update this else statement here. You did not enter valid age. Let's update that statement. That's not valid. I'll just say values are unavailable. Okay? We haven't used valid year, so we get a warning. So let's say you enter this as your wage in the current year of valid year. Right? So here we are using on line 97, we're using both the binded value, if it's true, and the valid year. So both values together, only if both are valid. Everybody with me? Otherwise, one of them are false, or one of them are nil. We come into the else statement. Okay? Let's run our code and see what's happening. Values are unavailable. That's the result. Why? Why is that? Andrea? Does everybody see that? Right? It's unavailable because year is nil, as Andrea is saying. Do we see that? Luba? So if we walk through the code again, it says binded value. In that case, it does have a value. Can we change binded value, since we know what binded value is, to make it more readable? Okay, so binded value is valid age here, or valid wage. Okay. I should have just replaced in scope. Okay, so valid wage is good. Okay, so if we have a valid wage, which we do, it's 40,000, and a valid year, which we do not have, it's nil. Do we agree it's nil? Yes, sir. 97. This guy. Oh, sorry. So that's valid wage, right? No, thank you. And this is valid year, right? Okay, so valid wage is 40,000 when we get here on line 89. So valid wage is 40,000. And valid year, what's valid year? It's nil, right? So if valid wage is 40,000, great, keep looking. If valid year has a value, oops, it doesn't, it's nil. I'm not gonna go inside that if let statement. Both values need to be valid. Do we see that? So the syntax, remember, we start with our if let, some variable name, the value we want to unwrap here, in that case is wage, followed by a comma, followed by let. We don't if let again, right? So we follow by a comma, the word let here, valid, whatever argument name you want to put in here, whatever variable name, and the other unwrapped value. And again, you could chain them together. To make it look more readable, you could press enter right before the let here. You could press enter right before the second let. So it staggers it together, so it's easier to read. Everybody with me? And we could add more values there. Yes, sir? It could be var if you want to change the variable inside. You see what I'm saying? So I can make this a var, for example, if you want to mutate what the year is. But best practice to make it a let. Okay? Unless you get to that use case like, oh, I want to change that variable. Okay? Right. So good, good, good. This is what that looks like. Any other questions? We have practiced with that. We have enough of those problem sets. The string interpolation for which one?
The one that you set it up to string describing.
Oh yeah, yeah, sure. 1 second. I got rid of it. Sorry. Let's create a new one. Did everybody type out the code so far? Okay, so let's do one more example, and then we'll go to testing optionals. Okay. So string interpolation. All right. What do we have? What do you want to have? What type of data do you want? Int, string, bool, int. Okay, so we have our model year. It's an int optional. We say 2006, for example. Say that again. Because you're in string interpolation, as the name says, it's a string. You're trying to have that type, the description of that type. So it could be any type. All types in a string, it returns the description of the type. Right? For example, we could say model year dot description. It returns us 2006. In that case, optional 2006. But the minute it has optional in that type, it wants you to use string describing. Or you could do nil coalescent, as I said, to give it a valid value. No, 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 no. Only string, because you're in a string interpolation. Cool? All right, so here I could just say print model year is. So we're trying to do string interpolation, correct? Using string interpolation, I say model year, right? I'm saying model year with the string interpolation syntax. It tries to get the description of model year, but that's an optional. You see what I'm saying? So the compiler is like, hey, I want to silence that warning. I could give you the default describing initializer with that particular data type, and it won't be an optional anymore. Or you could use it yourself saying, is this a model year? I could give it 0 here. Let's see. I could give it 0. Model year is 0, or some default, whatever, 1959. Right? Let's see what happens here. So model year is 2006, right? Again, I don't want to show that because, again, we have so much going on with nil coalescent and everything. But Steph, right, that gives us what the string describing would do. But we have more control now. Because we could say, if this is nil, 2006 is nil, what's going to get printed? Everybody, what's going to get printed? 1959, right? If we go ahead and print now. Right? So that's like using nil coalescent within our string interpolation syntax. So again, it gets more complicated the deeper you go into certain topics. But just for now, when you see the warning for that particular string there, just click fix it, okay? Until when you're comfortable with string coalescent. Because remember, you might be like, oh, I have a type here. I want to use string interpolating on it. But I keep getting a compiler error. Because if your type is not matching, right? Like if I have a string here, I'll get a compiler error. I'll start getting frustrated. Like, what's happening? Do you see where I'm going with that? Because here, model year is an integer. My default cannot be a string. It has to be an integer. Do we see that? Okay, cool. So here I'll say 1959 again. Cool. That's good. Thank you, Steph, for that one. All right, yes. Which one? Where am I? Where am I? Back to optional binding? Optional binding? 91, 91. No and. So, Brendan, who was bringing that up earlier? David. Jahid, sorry. Jahid was asking if we could have done commas with the regular if let, right? We don't, right? We do and or. If you're doing optional, which is our case here, if let, you start with if let, is optional binding. You want to add more values to that statement, comma. Very similar to like an array, you have comma as a syntax there. The next value is a comma. The next value is a comma. You with me? In that scenario. We'll have at least 2 cases of that in the lab, so we'll get used to it there. Good. I'll show one more thing and okay. Any other questions before we go to the last topic? Du jour, not du jour, but for optionals. Let's get ahead in and go through the last topic. Very brief, but just good to know. Again, we'll keep guard. There's more optionals there, but we'll keep guard. We'll keep while let for later. So optional binding here, we want to talk about testing optionals for equality. So simple use case, we have some value, which is an optional, initialized to 7. It's still an optional. If we option click on some value, it's int optional. But this is still valid to do this. So we could say if some value equal to 7, all right? We could say print, print some value is equal to 7. Okay? Okay. For now, just as I said before, just fix this with the compiler warning. Until we get familiar with more coalescing stuff, we could just go and give a default here. Okay, so here we have if some value equal to 7, some value is an optional. We could also optionally find for equality with a regular integer, right? That's the one use case where it works here. So now I will run my program, and it will tell me, it will look inside the box, see if there's a value, and find equality here. We're not trying to add values. Just if some value exists, look at that value against my 7. That's it, again, right? So it does exist. Just wanted to show you what that looks like. And I think we have time for one more that might be interesting, especially for lab. Yes, let's do it. What's that? The what? Yeah. Look at this guy. Okay, so let us do that. So looping through an optional array. Great. So here, let's see. I have some array of ints. I'll call it numbers. Var, is it? Let numbers int optional. Let's make it a var actually. Option click on numbers. We see it's an optional array of ints. It's an array of optional ints. There might or might not be valid ints in there. So now let's go ahead and assign numbers, some arrays, or some values. We'll start off with 4, 9, nil, 23, minus 67, nil. So here, 123, we have declared a variable called numbers, which is an array of optional ints. We assign numbers a literal array, including nil values. Now let's see how to go ahead and loop through that array. So for num in numbers, right? So for num in numbers, if we option click on num, what type is num? It's an optional int, right? As Christian is saying, it's an optional int. So far, so good. In here, if we want to add, say we have some, actually, let's make those easier to add up. So this is 13, 23, 43, right? Okay, so say you were given a question, go ahead and find the sum of the numbers array, right? How do we start? Well, we know how to use the for loop, right? So for number in num or for num in numbers, right? So far, so good? Okay. What else did we see today? We saw how to unwrap optionals, correct? So we could use any one that we learned so far. Well, not the force unwrapping, right? Because we know what happens there really quickly. So I could say if let valid number, for example, equal to number, right? If it is, I'll create some sum variable above here. Remember scoping. If we put sum within the for loop, what happens? If I go ahead and say I want to do sum in here, according to Amini, if I put my var sum inside my for loop, every time it comes back in my for loop, what happens? It gets overridden, right? Do we see that? If we don't, right, we could test it afterwards. But every time you come inside that for loop, it declares sum again to 0. So I'm not keeping track of sum anymore. Do we see that? So we want to make sure sum is outside of the for loop. Everybody with me? So go ahead and make sure your sum is outside your for loop. So every time it comes into the for loop, the sum is the previous value added. Right? You're not losing your sum here. So be very careful. Again, that's scope. All right, so if let some valid sum, great. What's the syntax am I writing here? I want to add sum together. What am I writing? So, so Eddie's saying sum plus equal, right? Valid num. You see already valid num is an int. It's no longer an optional. Everybody sees that? Does everybody see that? Okay, so we come here, we use optional binding to make sure that the value of sum gets unwrapped, right? I don't care about if it's nil in that case, right? There's no else there. But you could put an else if you want to, but in that case, I only want to add valid. I only want to add valid integers. Everybody with me? Lydia? Right? I only want to add valid integers. What are the valid integers, Lydia? Yeah, in our array of numbers, the valid integers. In that actual array here. The valid, right? Everybody sees that? 4, 9, 10, and 20, right? That's what I want to add. I don't want to add nil. It's nil. That's nothing, right? So I'm going to go ahead and use optional binding to unwrap. The current num. Okay? Cool. And now we're done with the for loop. We could print outside saying the sum of numbers is numbers, well, not numbers, but sum. Right? And the sum of numbers should be 43 in that case. Everybody with me? So that's also very powerful, right? You have an optional array, how to look through the optional array, how to use optional binding to get the valid values. Yes, you could also use nil coalescing here, right? But for now, we use optional binding. But you could use nil coalescing as well. Let's see how that looks. So we'll keep sum, let's say sum, let's rename sum to, so command click on sum, edit in scope. Let's change sum to sum unwrapped using optional binding. I know the name is long, but it gives us the context, right? Like we use sum here with optional binding, right? Everybody? And then we'll create a next sum using nil coalescing. Everybody okay? Okay, cool. So we have our nil coalescing, we'll put it down here. So here using nil coalescing. And here we are using, as I said over there, I'll just take that comment, put a comment here. Great. Cool. So here we're using optional binding. Here we'll use nil coalescing. Let's see what it looks like. So I have my sum using plus equal. Nil coalescing sum equal plus, and here we have num 0. I think we're done, right? So if it's not valid, it's 0. Everybody with me? So now let's go ahead. So our print statement, the sum of numbers, update that to say using optional binding here. And our second print statement will say the sum of numbers using nil coalescing. String interpolated, it's sum using nil coalescing, okay? And let's run it. Value should be the same. Okay? So both values should be the same. So the first one is using optional binding, and the second one is using nil coalescing, right? So as we saw, nil coalescing, one line, right? Again, very similar to the ternary operator. You do not want anything explicit or more complex after your default. You only want a default value. Nil coalescing is perfect for that. You want to have more context to where something is nil. Optional binding is perfect for that. Everybody sees that. Because in that else statement, you could put any amount of statements you want. In here, there's no statements for me. Everybody sees that? I either have a value or not, I use it. I'm done. So quick, concise, right to the point here. Okay, cool. So I think we are good with optionals. Question? Go up to, oh, this guy, where we define that? Okay. So we use two sums to differentiate between optional binding and nil coalescing. In that particular question, we could have used either or. Most situations, you could use either or. It depends on what you want to do in that else statement. Yes?
I'm not before you explain why the nil values are added. Why do they can't be added to it?
No, that's fine. So Andrea wants us to walk through. Everybody typed out everything? So let's walk through what's happening. So here on line 123, we declared a numbers array of optional integers. So far, so good? It's optional integers here. And we went ahead, we assigned our numbers. Our numbers was empty. We assigned it to an array of numbers with nil values, right? So far, so good. Now, we task with a question. Hey, go ahead and sum only the valid. I should probably put the question there. Let's put a question there that we're trying to answer. Add only valid integers. Cool? So that's the question. We declared a sum variable. We used two sums here to differentiate between the two types of optional unwrapping we'll do. We use a for loop to iterate through the array. No quicker way than a for loop. We said, hey, we only want to add the valid, right? Keyword valid, non-nil. So add only valid or non-nil, right? Non-nil integers. So this is a nil. This is nil, right? Everybody, it's not an integer or anything. It's nil. This is also nil. So we only want to add those four numbers together. How do we do that with a for statement? Well, in the for loop, we could have any condition we want. In that case, we're using optional binding to say, look at the current number. Maybe we should name that current number. Command, let's edit that. Let's call it current num. Cool? So look at the current number. If the current number, as we saw earlier, this is just taking optional binding and adding it to a for loop. So if current num has a value, assign it to valid num. And then go ahead and do the add operation. Right? That's good. It's good to walk through it. It's good. And go ahead and do the add operation. And keep doing it only on valid numbers. So far, so good? And we're doing the same thing here, right? Only with the nil coalescing option. If current num has a value, add it. If not, 0 is my default value. So 1 plus 0 is 1, right? If you have other questions like, hey, get me the average, then you need to figure out what is the valid, how many valids I have. Everybody with me? We have to leave some work for you to do in lab, but we could figure out how to know if it's valid or not. We could have a variable for that. Everybody? When you want to track things, you could use variables for that. How many times did I get in here? Can I find that out? How can I find that out, anybody? Yes? Dot count on, well, if I say dot count on the array, what's my number? Right? It takes all the values, remember? So that doesn't get us what we want. What else can I do? How can I know how many valid numbers I have? Yes, Benvenido. Everybody with that? So Benvenido is saying, hey, create a variable, call it count or whatever, right? And as I'm coming in the if-let, increment it by 1. Is that valid? I think that's valid, right? Because the only time I get in here is if it's valid. So I have a counter there. And at the end of the day, at the end of your for loop, you know how many times it was valid? 4. Then you could say sum divided by 4. There's the average. Everybody with me? That's probably one of the labs, so I'll leave it for you guys. I'm not going to solve it here. All right? But we have the answer already. Create some variable, keep track of it, divide it, you're done. Any other questions about optionals? Cool. So we are done. Thank you.